All right, everything should be up and running now. Okay, there we go. My stuff over here so it's not in my way. All right, everybody, welcome back. I have to move the chairs so I don't trip on them because I always do that. This loud one, okay. All right, so welcome back. Welcome back to SOC of Religion, right? SOC 376. Hopefully that's why you're here. We are now beyond add drop. So let me think, what's important? I know I added a whole bunch of people kind of towards the end of last week. I can't remember, I want to say it was on Wednesday. So the class is pretty big now for a 300 level SOC class. But if you have any questions, right, do feel free to ask. I'm going to turn the God's voice down a little bit. There we go. Okay, so today kind of the plan is to continue going through Smith's concept of how religion works, specifically the remaining causal mechanisms that we haven't talked about yet. And then sort of, depending on how much time we have, I think we'll have lots of time, start into talking about some sociological theories of religion. Alrighty, so, right, where were we? Just to recap, right? So if we go back one more slide, what we were talking about last time at the end of class, we went through the first three causal mechanisms. I'm going to go over them again really, really quickly here. So, what Smith says, right, to understand the role that religion plays in human societies, we have to look at the way its influence spreads out over time. Sometimes these influences are apparent and sometimes they aren't. And he gives us 10 causal mechanisms that we can use to talk about, how religions work. The most obvious one, is what he calls prescriptive teachings. That is the actual teachings of religion to religious people and how those people then put those things into practice, right? And it goes from things like rituals, clothing, how they live their lives, dietary rules, all of these sorts of things. The things that you would expect. Okay. Oh, this question. I keep talking about Edmonton new religious movements. Is there a running list or catalog of all known NRMs anywhere? No, not that I know of. I mean, I'm sure there are lists that people keep, but not like a publicly available one. And you know what? New religious movements are popping up all the time. So, they're funny things. Social mechanism, or causal mechanism number 2, it's our social influence of network ties, right? Sometimes being part of a religious group causes you to undertake behavior that isn't explicitly mandated religiously, right? So it wouldn't be part of prescriptive teachings, but because a lot of people that are part of that group partake in it, you might do that as well. So, the example I gave was homeschooling, right? Or voting Republican. In the US, right, a lot of evangelicals or more conservative Christians vote for the Republican Party, even though there's no explicit biblical or religious commandment to do so, right? It's just part of the culture of those groups. Same with homeschooling. And our last one, right, which is our contextual effects. And here it's just like, the larger social context has an effect on your religiosity, right? So if you live in a more religious society, or you move from a place that's less religious to a place that's more religious, your religiosity is going to go up, right? So if you move from, here down to here, or you move, say, from, for example, Edmonton down to Lethbridge, right? There's a lot of Mormons in Lethbridge. Your religiosity might go up a little bit, right? You would still remain whatever you were religiously before. It's not like unless you are a Mormon, you're not likely to convert to Mormonism. But say you're a Muslim, right? You might become slightly more of the word is escaping me, devout Muslim, right? Or if you're Catholic, you might become slightly more devout by moving to Lethbridge. If you move from New York to Florida, you might become slightly more religious than you were, and the opposite holds, right? If you move, from the Bible Belt out to Cascadia, Oregon, Washington, California, the least religious parts of the United States, likely your overall religiosity is going to drop a little bit to match that social surrounding. Again, it's not going to be like you're not going to turn into an atheist or agnostic. You might just become slightly less religious because the environment is slightly less religious. Okay, let me just go back and see. I answered this last time. The answer to that is no. Okay, causal mechanism number 4. And this one, again, is pretty easy to figure out, right? This isn't a particularly complex mechanism in lots of ways. A lot of religions, right, and this is, pretty well known, offer some kind of social service programs, right? And these services are relatively massive when you look at them in aggregate, right? So religious communities make huge impacts on the world through lots of religious social service programs that do all sorts of things, right? They provide material resources and other kinds of help to people, food, clothing, social services, counseling, all sorts of stuff, right? There is innumerable types of these services, right? Usually these are para-religious organizations, right? So they're affiliated with other religious organizations, but they wouldn't be, say, explicitly part of a church, mosque, or synagogue, right? So they are aligned with them, but not directly part of them, right? So something like, a lot of times food banks, historically, now I think they're mostly secular, but like if you go to Calgary, right? The Calgary Food Bank is still called the Interfaith Food Bank because it used to be a kind of coordinated effort between Catholic and I think broadly the United Church that came together to form an organization, a food bank to serve the whole city of Calgary back when religion was a little bit more prominent than it is today, but it still carries that name, right? Edmonton doesn't have that, we just have the Edmonton Food Bank, but it wasn't affiliated with a specific church or any specific religious organization. It was separate from them but aligned with them, right? So para-religious. There's lots of examples of this, even just in Edmonton or Alberta. In Edmonton, we have this particular group that offers a whole bunch of services called Catholic Social Services. Does all sorts of things from, counseling to, degrees of like providing clothing, newcomer support, all sorts of stuff goes through Catholic Social Services. There's organizations like World Vision and Development and Peace that do stuff in developing countries, right? They basically take resources, people pay them money here, and some of them like World Vision, I think you can adopt a child through World Vision, in part of the developing world, and you provide resources for that child to go to school and those sorts of things, right? Or you donate and they fund projects in other countries. Islamic Relief Worldwide, that is another one of these types of organizations. Gurdwaras, have active kitchens that provide food to anyone who comes and asks, right? And there's lots of Sikh and Hindu social service programs as well, even just in Edmonton, but globally as well. Okay, so these are, across the conservative progressive spectrum, right? They're not all conservative. There are more sort of, progressive ones that are still affiliated with religious groups. I don't think that it is affiliated anymore, but the United Way began its life affiliated with the United Church of Canada, right? And it's now a large kind of overall welfare organization. So there's lots of these. And in the US, religious charities disperse somewhere in the range of $100 billion mostly of in-kind services, right? But about $100 billion worth of social services. That's actually just cash, my bad. That's just cash. A careful study that they did in Philadelphia, looking at all the Philadelphia area religious congregations and how much social service they provided. So this is like in-kind, right? So things like volunteer hours, funds, donations, and all of these sorts of things. All together, just in Philadelphia, the value of these services was calculated at about $250 million. And globally, people have said it's impossible to calculate how much of this happens. Some people have put it in the trillions of dollars range, right? I've seen figures anywhere from $1 to $3 trillion worth of services, both cash and in kind. But it's really, really hard to figure out because there's all sorts of weirdness in the calculation, but it's a lot, right? And all of these things raise the profile of religious groups, right? And they allow them to reach out to people, to spread their religious beliefs sometimes, or just offer care and compassion to people with hopes that they'll then, potentially ask questions about that particular religion. Okay, so hopefully that I'm sure makes sense, right? Okay, that one's easy. I tried to not say too many, so I wouldn't burn too many examples. Okay. All right, so causal mechanism number 5, generating social capital. This one's a little bit more complicated and a little bit more difficult, right? So social capital, basically it's all related to social networks, right? Basically the web of people that you are connected to, right? So you have a network of people you're connected to. You're connected obviously to your family, your friends, relatives, friends of friends, family friends, people in communities that you're in, right? This would be your kind of social network. I guess the way that I always sort of think of social capital, it's not what you know, it's who you know, right? It's how you can use who you know to help you get things that you want in life, right? Okay, so social capital is a series of social relationships of trust and reciprocity. And we have different types of social capital, right? Bonding, and that's, oops, sorry, I made a line in the text that you probably want to read. I'll erase that. So bonding, right? Solidarity within and between groups. So, that bonding social capital, right? If you are part of a group, a club, a religious organization, a class, a school, whatever it happens to be, right? You create bonds with the people that are in that organization, and you're bonded to them, right? You know each other, you have some knowledge about each other, you maybe go and help each other in particular circumstances, right? And that makes you all feel like you're part of a community. So that's your bonding solidarity. What did I do there? Do I have my eraser? Oh, I do. But I don't want the eraser anymore. I want the pen. Okay, right, so that's your bonding. And bridging, right, relational ties between groups that differ in significant ways, right? So this is you and people around you reaching out to other people and other communities that are different in some ways and building bonds with them, right? Maybe you reach out to, you do an interfaith kind of outreach, something that's ecumenical, or, people from different socioeconomic classes. That would be bridging social capital. Okay. So social capital is really, really intangible, right? And it's one of these challenging concepts at times to get your head around, right? What is social capital? But it's basically your connections to other people in ways that they will support and help you, and you will support and help them, right? So despite being really intangible, it affects a whole bunch of social outcomes, right? And it's really valuable because it enhances individual lives and communities. Among the things that it does, right, it tends to foster more civic engagement, right? People with more social ties are more likely to be active in their communities. They're more likely to vote, right? They're more likely to be engaged with important issues, right? And if you've ever known someone who, say, was a member of a community league, and has gone to lots of community league meetings, you'll understand that people get really attached to their community league. And it becomes, often something they're quite passionate about, and they'll go to the mat for, things happening in that community. It helps community development, right? You create close bonds with people within communities, and that generally coheres the community together and often will help it to grow and offer more services. And, public health, it can be very good for public health. Specifically, some aspects like supporting vulnerable people and especially the elderly can be really useful there. Social cooperation, working together, getting people out to vote, right? Sorry, I don't want to burn too many examples here, but very famously in African American churches, right, or black churches in the United States, on election day, or often the Sunday before the election, right, if there's early voting on the Sunday, people will go to church, and they will then, after the service, get on a bus that takes them to the polling place, and the whole congregation goes to vote, right? So they can foster civic engagement or democratic participation in very important ways. I mean, other things too, like if you look at the history of African American churches, again, they do generate a lot of candidates out of these communities, right? Prominent people in the community will be sort of put forward by that community to be a congressman or a city councilor or what have it, right? And that community funds and supports them, which again, good for democratic participation. Public safety, often they play important roles in communities in terms of monitoring, giving young people places to go and activities to do, right, after school, especially in communities that are lower income. Social networks do a lot of that because, it's like, okay, this person is going to keep an eye on these kids, or we're going to open this community center so that, they can come play basketball or floor hockey or whatever after school so they're not getting into trouble. So it enhances public safety. And the more people right, the more people are keeping an eye on properties, on spaces, on each other's children. All of that is really, really helpful. And then educational achievement, right? The more socially connected you are, the better your educational achievement, the more, specifically, and if you want to look at what I teach in sociology of youth, the more trusted adults a young person has, the better their life outcomes are in general. So the bigger their social network is, the more people they're connected to, the better their life outcomes are in general. Okay, so now again, social capital is not something unique to religious groups. It just happens to be something that religious groups do really well. So according to Robert Putnam, right, and he wrote this really famous sociology book. You've probably heard it referenced again and again through especially if you've taken like 2 classes with me. It's kind of considered a modern classic of sociology, Bowling Alone. And what Putnam says in that book is that religious communities are key sites of social capital generation, largely because that belief in superhuman powers, right, and that desire to access superhuman powers keeps the same people coming back over and over again for years. So those communities have this kind of self-reinforcing bond that keeps them coherent, right, for longer periods of time. And even in an era where we see religious communities sort of declining in lots of ways, Putnam says there's still key sites of social generation, and about half the social capital generated in America, when he wrote the book in kind of the late 90s and revised it in the 2010s, he said that about half the associational membership, another way of talking about social capital in America, was generated by churches. Okay, lots of questions. Part 2. Okay, part 1, part 2, part 3. All right, let's take part 1. Does social service programs work in the same way if they only help those within the community, not outsiders as well? Like the TikTok where the woman conducted a social experiment, which she was asking for formula for her baby, and most said no because she's not a member of their church. Okay, okay, that's an interesting question. All right, so I see your question. Thank you for that lovely 3-part question. So yeah, I mean, that would still be, social services. Now, in a lot of cases, specific, say, religious congregations, yes, might offer services only to members of their communities. And certainly, they will offer, specific things to people that they know. They might offer it to outsiders. They might not. And I'll be honest, I heard about this TikTok thing. I never really looked into it very deeply. So commenting on the specifics is a little difficult. Now that said, right, if someone goes to a mosque, synagogue, church, gurdwara, or whatever, and gets food, right, whether or not, they're an insider or outsider, it still, counts as that kind of social welfare service. They're providing some level of value to that person. Now, most typically we are thinking about those bigger organizations, right, the United Way, Catholic Social Services, food banks. See, if I keep talking, I'm going to burn more examples, and I'm trying to not get rid of the most obvious ones, because, I'm trying to leave examples. In the past in this class, I've said a million examples, and then people are like, I can't think of an example that you didn't talk about in class. So, I don't want to keep going. Yeah, I'm trying to think of other ones. We typically think of more prominent ones, right? Soup kitchens, that sort of thing that offer services to unhoused people, shelters, right? Without mentioning any specific ones. Those would all be more what we're thinking. But yeah, I don't know if it's as much the case here because I've never really heard of it, but I know in the US, there's individual churches like, I can't remember what the name of the church is. It's in Moscow, Idaho. And I can't remember the name of it off the top of my head. But they have a food pantry, right, that's right in the church, and anyone can kind of show up and ask for it. But yeah, as with that, TikTok thing, I'm not 100% certain because I didn't follow that story carefully. I heard about it on the periphery, but I also heard TikTok, and I'm 43, and I was like, this isn't for me. So I kind of tuned it out, right? And I often assume that there's so much of that stuff that's edited to make, a specific polemical point that I kind of ignore it. So yes, it would still count for sure. Okay, what did I do? Wait. In and out. Okay. Is confession a type of counseling offered by churches, or is that something totally different? So I would probably put confession, right, if we're talking about particularly Roman Catholicism, right, outside of that, social service or counseling thing. Because, typically priests are not providing counseling, at least not any priests I know, and I think the idea, especially now, is not to do so. And the specific idea behind confession in Roman Catholicism is that priest is acting as Jesus, right, in persona Christi, if you want to use the kind of Latin-y term, right, in the person of Christ, and forgiving your sins, right? But that's more of an access to superhuman powers kind of question, right? That's actually that priest acting in the person of God. Generally speaking, given a lot of things that have happened in the Catholic Church, there would be, sorry, I just saw the smiley face with a tear. I tried to be vague about that one to not burn specific examples, thank you. There's now pretty strong prohibitions against giving too deep of counseling, just because it can open, especially in the confessional, it can open room for abusive relationships to form at times. Okay, so I'm gonna clear that. But yes, I would put that more as a specific religious practice rather than counseling. Would scholarships and bursaries provided by religious groups for members of that religious group be something that falls under educational achievement? Sure, yeah, that makes sense. I think I got a Knights of Columbus scholarship back in the day, $500, helped pay the tuition. It was good. For our own example, should we be trying to pick specific organizations or institutions that show a mechanism? Yes. No. Yes to the first one. Specific examples, right? Specific organizations and institutions. General ones will get you part marks, right? But more specific ones, which is why I'm trying not to mention specific organizations so I don't burn those very specific examples. Oh, you meant to students, yes. Right, of course, because if it shows up in the Slido, it's burned. Right now you can't use that one. So keep those to yourselves. Okay, this one's, another. Religious institutions secularized, right? All right, so religious practitioners and I'm going to highlight, I don't know why, I'm sure you don't need it, in past generations, right? So in the past, built institutions, and those institutions over time lost their religious character, right? So in the past, they existed because they were founded by religious people, right? Today they're secular, but they exist for religious reasons, right? Religious causes built them and established them, right? So they exist specifically because of those things. So any power that they have, today is partially a religious effect, right? Because they wouldn't exist if they hadn't been founded for religious reasons. I'm going to burn a whole bunch of examples here, right? The YMCA, not just a silly dance or a series of gyms, but it was, Young Men's Christian Association, right? It was actually founded as a place for young Christian men to gather. And it's, now, that purpose of the YMCA is far in the past, right? It's completely disappeared. There's no religious aspect to the YMCA today. It's entirely secular. But the YMCA and all of the stuff it does, the gyms, the pools, the childcare, the summer camps, any of that stuff wouldn't exist without that initial religious founding. And then some other things, right, and again, depending on your depth of knowledge of the history of university, all of our Ivies, right, or our three big Ivies, Harvard, Yale, and Princeton, all come out of very specific religious traditions, right, Protestant traditions. Harvard is Congregationalist, barely exists anymore. Yale, I don't remember. Princeton, was founded by Presbyterians. They still have, one of the big Presbyterian seminaries is still Princeton Theological Seminary, which is on the campus of Princeton University. And then, Cambridge, Oxford, and things like the Red Cross. These are all things that have a religious founding. They were founded by religious people based on their religious beliefs, but today they are largely secular, right? Harvard, is no longer run by Congregationalists. I think it still has a Harvard Divinity School, but that's not at the center of Harvard's mission, right? It's now a very secular university, as is Yale, as is Princeton. Cambridge and Oxford, right? You can trace back into the Middle Ages, right? But founded largely by monarchs and the church for religious reasons again. And the Red Cross obviously is a social care organization that was founded specifically to provide relief. Okay. Does that make sense? Okay. No questions. Perfect. I love it when that happens. Okay. Oh. So, this one's can be a little bit harder to grasp, right? So this is our secular transposition of religious dispositions and practices, right? So, sometimes religious ideas and behaviors end up getting kind of transposed into non-religious contexts, right? Things like, living simply or living an ascetic life that you find a lot in environmentalist movements. Like, how would I put this? Sometimes people talk about getting off the grid, right? You want to get off the grid, you want to live off the land, right? Disconnect yourself from the modern world. That largely mirrors, kind of historical movements like Christian ascetic ideas, right? And I think, did I talk about the desert monks? I talked about the desert monks earlier, right? The desert monks who in early Christianity, they were like, to hell with this place. The world is going to crap. So I'm going to go live in a cave and pray, right? And that's what I'm going to commit my life to. In some ways, getting off the grid shares a lot of kind of features of that deep Christian asceticism, right? Which is like the best life is the simple life, is the one that's most closely connected to nature, that has the least material confusion, right? Okay, so this is a point that Smith makes in a book, his book on racial relations, and I'm forgetting the title now. It's written with Michael Ondaatje. But I forget the title. It's escaping me. I can look it up at some point. Talking about American evangelical Protestants, right? What he says is they tend to reproduce the racial structures of American society because evangelicalism, very specifically, is individualistic, right? It views, your relationship with other people and with, the divine as an individual one, and so it tends to forget about structural divides, right? So evangelicals will often be like, well, I'm nice to all the black people I personally know, right? So racism is not a problem, so we don't have to worry about it on a societal level. So if you ever wonder why, like, and you hear in the news, evangelicals seem a little bit resistant to a lot of, narratives about race relations in the United States, it's largely driven by the sort of ideological commitments that evangelicalism has at its core, and some of its idea about how you relate to God, right? You have a personal relationship with Jesus, and how do you affect other people? Well, through personal relationships. And so, they view everything on the level of the personal, and the structural escapes their consciousness in major ways. Okay, so other things. I'm sure none of you would have thought of this example anyway. Christian abolitionists, right, from the 19th century, right, so those that were, like William Wilberforce, who were specifically responsible for the abolition of slavery in the British Empire, a lot of their rhetoric and their actual kind of ideas are mirrored in contemporary movements like Black Lives Matter, right? So this is not as direct as other causal mechanisms, right? There are subtle connections, right? So even if we go back, right, and I showed you that video of not Spider-Man Tom Holland, historian Tom Holland, as I keep telling you, the cool one. The cool Tom Holland, the historian, talking about how the ideas that come out of the 7 New Testament letters that we ascribe to Paul, how that's affected things like international law. That would be, the secular transposition of religious dispositions and practices, right? Even notions of, the equality of all people regardless of things like race, gender, race, gender, ability, disability, right? All of these things. You might largely find that coming out of, say, Christian ideas taken from like Galatians, right? This, I can't remember what part of Paul's letter to the Galatians says, right? There's neither man nor woman, slave nor free, but all are one in Christ, right? This idea gets carried forward into ideas of equality that you find in, say, like the American Declaration of Independence. It gets secularized, eventually through this process, but it has this sort of religious root at its core, and that's the case that Smith is making. All right. No questions. Perfect. All right. Causal mechanism number 8. So, legal codes, right? So institutional legal codes. This one, again, is a little bit easier to get your head around. Legal codes are frequently influenced by religious traditions even after religions have lost some of their cultural power, right? So today, even the way we broadly treat sex work is still broadly shaped by a Christian kind of sexual morality, right? In most of the West, right? We still treat, sex work as a moral problem, principally, and that is reflected then in sort of the legal systems that form around it. And we may change the way that we enforce them, right? We're less on the supply side now, and we tend to enforce more on the demand side, right? Following a sort of Nordic model. But we still ultimately view this, sex work as a bad thing. And efforts by, say, third wave or post-feminists, sex-positive feminists to say sex work is work have largely fallen on sort of, shall we say, deaf ears, or go so against the sort of cultural fabric and the legal fabric that's long established that they've been hard to kind of put into law, right? And yeah, a lot of Anglo-American kind of legal theory, right, or jurisprudence comes out of, is predicated on what you would call natural law, right? And you can trace natural law, so it's a philosophical kind of way of understanding the world, principally to, not Augustine, Thomas Aquinas, right? St. Thomas Aquinas. The Catholic philosopher from the Middle Ages, right? And probably the preeminent Catholic philosopher, right? Thomas Aquinas, or you might hear, take philosophy, the scholastics, right? A lot of, say, kind of principles of even things like rights, human rights, are fundamentally predicated on assumptions that are inherently kind of Catholic, right? They come from Thomas Aquinas, maybe Maimonides, right? So the Jewish philosopher that was a contemporary of Aquinas, they were in dialogue. Outlines a natural law kind of theory. And natural law is this idea that, God created the world, and so nature and the laws that are built into nature somehow reflect sort of divine law, right? So what, your sense that human beings have dignity and rights comes out of the fact that, a God who created the world and imbued people with dignity and rights is at the base of nature, right? So when you get something like this, the idea that all men are, highlighter, this is the key part for the Declaration of Independence, created equal, right, by God, that they are endowed by their Creator. So, within nature, our Creator endows certain unalienable rights like life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Also, Greenland. Terrible. You're a terrible person, Broussard. Stop it with the Greenland jokes. Okay. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of Greenland, right? So, this kind of definition of human rights, right, that comes out of the American Constitution, and then the Americans, through their influence in the world, spread to other places in the world, right? So a lot of the democracy movements of the 20th century echo this kind of language. You hear it in the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Stop burning examples, Broussard. Right, all of this comes essentially from a religious root in the philosophy of Thomas Aquinas, right? So yeah, arguably, and I mean, some people will argue against this, so, take it for what it's worth. The whole notion of human rights, and again, this is largely the case that N.T. Wright and non-Spider-Man Tom Holland are making, is that human rights emerges from a Christian context, right? From Christian roots, and that it becomes hard to sustain without at least a minimalist kind of theology attached to it, right? You don't have to believe in the whole human story. And I mean, sorry, how to put this? Arguably, right, people like Thomas Jefferson and the other American founding fathers weren't, devout Christians. They were more deists, right? So they believed that a God had made the world and then sort of was like, okay, great, looks good. I'm going to go do something else now. The universe is created with universal laws built in. Huzzah, I'm gone, right? That's a kind of minimalist theology, like, oh yeah, there's a God, he created it, and he gave us rights, and then he went away, and there's no, we don't have to worry about that anymore. Without at least that kind of minimalist theology, some of that breaks down. And people will point to, specifically anti-religious movements, a lot of times that do away with the notion of human rights in the broad sense that we think of it, communism being one, as it was practiced in the Soviet Union in particular, but a lot of other secular movements, and you can look at the philosophy of and the ethics of someone like Peter Singer, who will say, like, it's perfectly fine to commit infanticide. Like, if you have a baby and you decide you don't want it, you can kill that baby because that baby is basically less sentient than your dog, right? So until that baby becomes sentient, it really has no moral worth. Actual person, he works at Princeton. I think he's still at Princeton. But he's, clearly an atheist. So without a kind of minimalist theology, the argument is, and again, there's lots of arguments against as well, that a notion like universal human rights is pretty unsustainable. And I mean, Singer is a pretty broad advocate of like euthanizing disabled people for all sorts of reasons. Okay. I am talking really fast. Okay, number 7. Could you say that 2 instances may mirror each other? But okay, hang on, I gotta see what number 7. Okay, I remember. Okay, so could you say that 2 instances may mirror each other, but the non-religious specific one may not be consciously or directly meaning to do so? I mean, yeah, so that potentially would be true, right? That you might have, indirect. Now, I think the argument that Smith would make about that is some of these religious assumptions are deeply built into our cultures, often in ways that we struggle to actually notice or articulate, right? And I mean, this is like, when we get to deep culture and invisible religion, this is kind of the point that he's making. I'll go back to your question. So I think the argument that Smith would make is sometimes, right, you might have two instances that mirror each other, but you're not even aware necessarily of where your ideas come from. They're so deeply ingrained into culture, right, that they might have been religious at some point, and the ideas have carried forward without a conscious even acknowledgement of where the ideas come from, right? So I think that would be the answer he would give. I wish I had his phone number. I would just call him. Also, I love Christian Smith, so, that'd be just great if I could just have his phone number. If any of you could work on that, that'd be great. I'm sure I could find it on the Notre Dame website, but I'm not confident he would pick up. Okay, does it have to be actual laws, or can it be more like, this is okay because it's in the Bible? So I'm assuming you're talking about institutional legal codes, right? There has to be some kind of like institutional structure behind it, right? I think that's what you're talking about. If I didn't answer your question, please rephrase and move forward. How do traditional indigenous religious beliefs and practices fit into this framework? Okay, so that's, what's probably a complicated part of that question. It's a really good question. Is largely because of the way history has gone, right? Indigenous religious beliefs and practices have largely been kind of pushed to the side of mainstream society. And so it would affect, say, things like, native law, practices within bands, and governance, but it would be at a much smaller scale than at like a societal scale because of the sort of, shall we say, imposition of Western legal codes over indigenous kind of pre-existing legal codes, practices, and beliefs, right? So it would, well, I know that. I've tried. He doesn't answer, he has an assistant. He doesn't answer his own emails. I probably shouldn't admit to knowing that. I said phone number, people, preferably home or mobile. I'm kidding, you don't actually have to find, please don't. I don't want my students stalking Christian Smith. He is a fantastic scholar though. You'll hear about him lots. Okay. Could we use historical laws for the exam? Number 8, does that have to be current laws? Historical laws are fine. Don't give any examples at the moment or they'll be burned. Okay, so I think I answered this. Would mechanism number 8 be null in the context of a theocracy? I think in a theocracy it would be even more explicit, right? There you could kind of say like, okay, you could cross out this part, right? Even after religions have lost some of their cultural power, legal codes are often influenced by religious traditions, period. Stop, right? In this case, we live in a theocracy, so we don't, but if we did, right? Then it would actually be like, well, that religion hasn't lost some of its cultural power. The point Smith is making is like, say in most of Europe, right? Religion has lost some of its cultural power, or a lot of its cultural power, even in Canada, but we still have the influence. But in some places, right, it may not have lost some of its cultural power. Okay. Would laws that Christians claim come from a religious belief but aren't actually in the Bible count? For sure, right? Like, I hope that's not real, but I'm going to keep that there just in case. I'm going to try it later. We're going to see what happens. Maybe you're good at hacking. That'd be kind of scary. Okay, cool. I hope that's an office. I was completely joking, in case you're not aware. I joke a lot. But I am going to keep that. I'm going to hold on to it and try it later. So, would laws that Christians claim come from religious belief but aren't actually in the Bible count? Okay, yes, because a lot of times, right, even if you look at a lot of kind of claims that Christians will make about the law, it's not so much, sometimes there might be an explicit kind of prohibition against something, but sometimes it's inferential, right? Or it's philosophy that's come out of, say, a framework, right? A Catholic framework, that then influences legal codes, right? So frankly, right, if you're talking natural law isn't really spelled out in the Bible. It comes from a sort of synthesis that Aquinas makes of Aristotle and kind of Catholic belief. He kind of synthesizes the two together. And he's like, okay, Aristotle had all these cool ideas largely about natural law, and now we're going to Christianize them, and we get that, and that forms the kind of legal basis of a lot of legal theory through the Middle Ages, the Enlightenment, and into modernity, even though, say like the Enlightenment thinkers were trying to expressly repudiate Christianity in a lot of cases, and I think you can make the argument fairly easily that what they did was basically secularize a lot of essentially Christian principles, right? Because that was the world they came from. They had no other way of seeing things. And they took ideas from Thomas Aquinas like natural law. And like I said, Jefferson, certainly no Roman Catholic, a Unitarian Universalist in his beliefs, but he took that same kind of principle of natural law and applied it, in the American Constitution with a very minimalist kind of theology, right? Barely acknowledging a God at all, and certainly not, referencing the Christian God specifically, just a kind of general deity, if you will. Okay, cool. These are great questions. These are hard questions. I like hard questions. Okay, direct intervention by religious authorities, right? So sometimes religious authorities just do stuff, right? And they may actually, take direct action in the world, right? So they can affect the world through direct interventions. They might make a speech or mobilize people to do something, whatever it happens to be, right? So things like Gandhi's nonviolent confrontation with British colonial authorities. I know Gandhi, not necessarily a religious figure, but we're going to throw him in there, because his beliefs are largely, or his actions were largely predicated on certain religious values. A better example might be, and I think I've talked about him before here, Martin Luther King, right? So the Reverend Martin Luther King, he was actually, the head of a Protestant church, right? I think it's Ebenezer Church, if I recall correctly. That's why he's the Reverend Martin Luther King. He has plays a vital role in the U.S. Civil rights movement, using broadly Christian themes. Like, it's easy to kind of pass by them today. But if you go listen to, say, like the I Have a Dream speech, right, and he's talking about, I have seen the promised land, he's using explicitly kind of Christian biblical language. And black churches in the United States have always had a real affinity for for obvious reasons, I think, the Hebrew exodus out of Egypt, right, coming out of slavery into freedom, right? They've always had a strong affinity with that particular story, and he uses a lot of imagery of the promised land, right? The Israelites were promised the land of Canaan by God. I'm sure that won't cause any problems in the future. And he's using that same language of a promised land, but he's kind of putting it as, a place where you have equality, right? This kind of equality that's promised in kind of Christian language, right? So he uses that, in support of his cause. He's trying to prick the conscience of a lot of northern whites who are, white Protestants in the northern part of the United States, prick their conscience to support his cause from a legal basis. And yeah, the black church, plays a big role in supporting King and his allies. And I'll play you a clip of this one. Pope John Paul II, right, is often credited in playing a major role in bringing down communism in Poland, right? And subsequently, like, Poland is like the first domino, and then you get East Germany, and then all the other communist countries sort of start to crumble. And in large part, people will often credit this particular moment that I'm about to show you, where John Paul II, he's Karol Wojtyła, he's Polish, went back to Warsaw as Pope. And here, I'll play you a little clip. My pen rolled, even though it's oblong. Cool. All right, I'm gonna take a breath.
someone had told me when I was a kid in the 1970s that the Soviet Union and its communist empire would collapse with barely a shot being fired, and that one of the principal instigators would be the Pope of Rome, I would never have believed it. Yet that's precisely what happened. John Paul II came to this square, Victory Square, in the heart of Warsaw, and he celebrated Mass in front of hundreds of thousands of people. During the homily, the Pope spoke of God, he spoke of freedom, he spoke of human rights. And as he delivered the homily, the crowd began to chant, "We want God, we want God." The Pope continued, and the chant went on, "We want God, we want God." Then it was picked up rhythmically by everybody in the square, "We want God, we want God." Perceptive people at the time knew that the Soviet control over Poland, the communist empire, was effectively finished. This move of John Paul II is one of the most remarkable examples in our time of provocative nonviolence.
Okay, I should probably credit it, but I don't. That clip is from the Robert Barron's documentary Catholicism. Okay, whoops, I didn't want to do that. No, cool, helpful. All right, I'll have to try that. Okay, the last one, right? Causal mechanism number 10, deep culture and invisible religion, right? Okay, so this one, again, I don't think is impossibly difficult to grasp. But the idea here is that, yeah, we have these often unacknowledged categories, assumptions, beliefs, and intuitions that are largely driven by the cultures that we come from. And a lot of those kind of cultural assumptions and categories are driven by ideas that are deep in the culture, right? So, I've said too many times. I think I've reached my quota. Again, if we go back to non-Spider-Man Tom Holland and that clip we looked at, right? His notion that ideas like international law, human rights, are deeply rooted in kind of Christian assumptions that come out of Paul, right? Specifically, the 7 letters of Paul, is sort of what Smith has in mind here, right? That, in the West, we have a 2,000-year sort of interaction with Christianity, right? Christianity has been really central to the culture for a really, really long period. And so some of the ideas of Christianity have worked their way deep into sort of that cultural consciousness and the basic assumptions of Western culture. And that would be true as well, right? If you go to India, right, Hinduism will have affected, the way people look at the world in fundamental ways that can be really hard to appreciate if you're inside that system, right? Because for you, that's just the world, right? That's just what the world is. And your whole set of cultural assumptions is going to be shaped by that context. The same, right, if you come from a Muslim country, right? That 1,400 years of Islam is going to affect your worldview in very, very distinct ways. And often these things, what Smith says, they operate invisibly, right? So that it can be really, really difficult to see. This is another point that non-Spider-Man Tom Holland, I'm just going to keep saying that. I don't know why. It's fun to say. Erica, how are you feeling? Still good? Okay. I mean, you have to be. We still got like a half hour. Okay. So, for example, right, our culture, kind of contemporary culture, sees value and moral superiority in some senses in being a victim, right? Like, this is the point that Holland makes at the beginning of that clip. And, maybe before we move on from this, I'll go back and play it a little for you again. Or you know what, you can go back and look at it. It's embedded in the PowerPoint. I won't play it again because we have other things to do. But he compares it to Roman culture, right? And in Roman culture, there's absolutely no moral status in being a victim, right? The person who was to be held up as having moral worth was Caesar, right? Caesar, who goes through and slaughters 1 million Gauls, people from France, the Gauls, and enslaves another 1 million, right? He's held up as, a preeminent kind of Roman figure. And it's only with the coming of Christianity, right, that the victim becomes kind of a central figure in the culture and really important. And why? Well, because Jesus is crucified, right? Jesus himself is unjustly put to death, right? So the person of the highest moral value in kind of a Christian system is himself a victim, right? So when we see, someone who's being victimized or oppressed, the immediate kind of Western instinct in a lot of cases to raise that person up. They have higher moral worth, a higher moral standing than the person who is oppressing them, right? The oppressor, for us, is the real villain of the story, and the oppressed, right, is the one with moral standing, right? And this is largely a Christian idea, right? And to the extent that we see it in different places in the world, it's largely because, Western Christianity has gone on to impact other parts of the world. So, we rarely might stop and think about where these deep ideas come from. And you might, for example, find, like if you ever kind of heard people talk about, say, conflict theory or Marxism, right? It's almost always in this oppressor-oppressed binary, right? With the oppressed being the one that has moral value, which is why, a lot of people will say that Marxism is inherently kind of a Christian heresy, right? A basic secularization and twisting of Christian values towards a materialist historical end, right? So, this one's another good example. Another example, whether a culture sees history as progression, a process of degradation, or a repeating cycle is typically driven by religious assumptions, right? There's a specific kind of way we talk about things. We talk about Abrahamic religions and their visions of history, right? That they have an eschatology, right? That they're working towards an end point, right? So, for Christians in particular, right, it's the return of Jesus, the end of the world, right? The apocalypse, the judgment of the whole creation and the creation of a new creation that doesn't have any kind of end. But if we look at, say, the way this has been seen in Western cultures almost always think of history as a progression, right? Like we're moving from here, and this is ignorance, and we're moving here to enlightenment, and that enlightenment will be utopia, right? That's largely the narrative that we get out of the Enlightenment, right? It's secularized, but it still has this notion that we're going to progress until utopia, right? Other cultures might have, Asian cultures famously have, a vision of history as a process of degradation, right? It was better in the past, right? There was this golden age, and as we move forward in history, we see the world actually degrading gradually over time. And some religions have, cycles of death and rebirth kind of built into them, right? Repeating cycles, or the idea that time is cyclical, right? It comes around again. And largely where you sit on this is going to be driven by, deep philosophical ideas or theological ideas that you're probably barely aware of at the end of the day. Okay, so those are our 10 causal mechanisms. Okay, no questions about invisible deep culture and invisible religion. Just a bunch of phone numbers. Okay. All right. I'm gonna jump to our next topic here. How much time do I have? I have 20 minutes left, so we'll do that. I know. I will discard, and these comments should still be there. So if you want to keep asking questions about this, absolutely do that in the next PowerPoint. It uses the same code, I think, if I've done things right. So you can keep asking questions. We'll come back. We are going to move on to our next topic. Okay, so now we're going to talk about some theories of religion, right? So that's kind of our, that's kind of our preamble, right? That's our notion of what religion is, and we're going to, stay to that Christian Smith definition as much as we can. and how religion works, right? That it's principally oriented towards people accessing superhuman powers, right? I think that's a good place to be. That all those other aspects of religion are important but secondary, and that it often spreads through these 10 causal mechanisms. Okay, so now what we're going to do, though, is we're going to talk about some of the theories of religion that have, been proffered by different sociologists at different times to explain, essentially how religion does its work, what it is. So we're going to give you a sense of the history of the discipline of sociology of religion. Now, I'm going to do a pretty brief jump through the big three, right? The ones you're probably sick of hearing about if you've taken enough sociology courses: Marx, Durkheim, and Weber. I'm going to spend a ton of time with them because I think there's some more interesting kind of theories to look at. But we're going to start with them because we kind of have to. And a lot of, even contemporary assumptions about religion are still driven by these three scholars. Now, putting my cards on the table, I don't like any of them and their thoughts on religion. I don't. If I were ever to teach a smaller class here, I would never get you to read any of their work on religion because I don't love it, right? I think there's better stuff that comes later, and you'll get to meet my spirit animal. At least I hope he's my spirit animal, Rodney Stark, later on, because I love Rodney more than I love Christian Smith, except that Rodney's dead. So he looks down on me from sociology heaven or sociology hell. I don't know which one. He was I call him a human honey badger because he's got a mean streak to him, which I'll tell you about later, because I do deeply love Rodney. And you're going to get sick of hearing about him because you're going to hear about him through the rest of the course. But he is my favorite. Even though he's the meanest, he's the one that always has impressed me the most. But we'll get to him later. Okay, so Karl Marx. The man I lovingly refer to as Uncle Karl because I've spent so much time with him through my life as a sociologist. So Marx. Really famously, Karl Marx's theory of religion, right, or specifically why people turn to religion, is often referred to as deprivation theory. Right, so what do we know about Marx, right? What do we kind of know about his worldview? I think you probably all know it pretty well. So Marx was, living at this time, middle of the 19th century, where the Industrial Revolution and all of its changes were roiling, right? And there's a lot of suffering that was caused by industrialization. People that had moved in, large numbers into the cities, that crowding had caused living conditions to be quite poor. People were working really hard and earning really low wages. And so his kind of worldview is largely, he bases a lot of it, especially on religion, on his mentor, Ludwig Feuerbach. But largely, right, he's interested in questions of social stratification. In this case, between the proletariat, right, the working class, and the ownership class, the bourgeoisie. And he and his co-author, Friedrich Engels, are really concerned or really interested in, how this capitalist class manages to rule despite sort of oppressing everybody, right? And what he suggests is that the values of the ruling class predominate over others largely because they control the means of production of ideas, right? So the newspapers, books, and all of that stuff. And he thought of religion principally as being in support of the values of the ruling class, right? That religion was just another elite institution that ultimately served the working class. Oh, sorry, not the working class, the ruling class. It allowed the powerful to give religious justification for the world as it was, and basically say, well, what's the line? If God hadn't wanted them sheared, he shouldn't have made them sheep, right? Sort of that kind of general idea that the working class were there because God put them there, and God had put in the social order, so you'd better obey it. Okay, now why his theory is often referred to as deprivation theory? Well, specifically because what he believes is that people turn to religion largely out of material deprivation, right? Because they don't have enough food to eat, their living conditions are terrible, and religion promises a perfect afterlife or some reward in the hereafter. And he thought that, this promise of a reward in the hereafter made, oh, sorry, I meant to get my highlighter out. I will get this one day. Made life livable now, right? That basically it's like, well, your life sucks, but you're going to get, you're going to die someday, and you're going to go to heaven, and in heaven, you'll, if you've lived a good life and you've obeyed the social order, you will have, an endless banquet or paradise or eternal happiness or whatever, right? Whatever it is that was being promised or that he thought was being promised. So he thought that's why it's material deprivation and, a terrible life that led people to turn to religion. And so he conceived of religion largely as something that's done, that is lived out by poor people, and basically rich people, to the extent that they were religious, were doing so in a sort of cynical way because it allowed them to maintain their social status, right? They're part of the social order. Very famously, right? So this is this famous Marx quote that religion is the sigh of the oppressed creature, the heart of a heartless world, and the soul of soulless conditions. It is the opium of the people, right? And herein, this has always been what people kind of take away from Marx's view on religion. And occasionally I get a little salty about it because, the longer quote, I think, is more what he's thinking. People turn to religion, right, to basically drug themselves, right? Because the world is so awful that you need to reduce the pain somehow just to get through. And you do that by taking the religion drug. And it's like, well, the afterlife will be great. So, he calls it the opium of the people and stresses, it tranquilizes the underprivileged into accepting their lot in life. So that's, in a nutshell, right? Marx's view, and he thinks that, religion isn't, there's no there, right? Marx is an absolute atheistic materialist. He believes there's no God to which we can make reference, right? That it's all a social construct, right? And we talked about that when we talked about our definitions of religion, right? Marx is very much a social constructionist. He thinks that we create religion in whatever shape we have, reflecting our own views of what we want the divine to be, based on our, the societies we live in. And that's his sort of view, right? And again, there's some virtue to Marx's vision, though there are certain problems with it as well. Sometimes, and historically, church authorities have supported gender and class inequalities, right? There are times where religion has been at the very heart of control, right? Where powerful religious figures have been part of the social elites or part of the governing class, right? This is certainly, I think, without dispute, or religion has been used to justify practices like slavery, like the subjugation of women, and all sorts of things like that. Now, Marx, and I think one of the problems, there's a few problems with it. Let me see, what do I have on the next slide? I won't talk about that yet. One of the problems, and I switched to yellow, so now you can't see anything. Must be getting to the end of class because I'm losing the pen power. Right. One of the many problems is that Marx's view of religion is definitely reductionist, right? Religion, yes, is sometimes used to justify social oppression, but it's also sometimes the tool that the oppressed use against their oppressors, right? And you can speak, there's ample examples of this in history, right? We can talk about the civil rights movement and how, King used the explicit Christian language sort of against the kind of oppressive class in the South, right? By pointing out the moral incongruity of, of segregation and oppression of Black people in very Christian language, right? And it, like I said earlier, it kind of pricked the supposedly Christian consciences of at least some number of people at the time enough that they passed things like the civil rights law. But there are numerous examples of this throughout history, right? We can find it in, certainly we find examples of it in the history of Islam as well, right? In a lot of ways, early Islam is much more ethnically bound than it is today, right? And largely what happens is as people are, conquered by Muslims, they then convert to Islam and they're like, well, just because you're Arab, that doesn't make you more of a Muslim than I am. So I demand full Muslim rights. And that becomes baked into the kind of system of Islam, right? That, yeah, if you're conquered and you convert, you're just as much of a Muslim and you get all of the rights that any other Muslim gets, right? So it's been used in lots of ways as anti-oppressive. And so, shall we put it this way? The verdict of history has at least as much evidence against Marx's kind of view as it does for it. And so I think we have to kind of call it a wash, right? He's right sometimes, and in other cases, he's very much wrong. Okay, can I do Marx? And then we'll stop after Marx. 80-minute classes are long. Okay, so this is Groucho Marx, by the way, not Karl Marx. He's a different Marx, a comedian from the early 20th century. Okay. Marx ultimately believed that religion was going to fade away, right? Because it was part of this system of inequality. It's part of what made economic oppression possible. And he thought that, as we trended towards, communism, right? Right? As we marched towards the victory of communism, religion would simply fade away. Because it's all based on material deprivation, if you can get rid of material deprivation, religion goes away, right? That's the sort of basic Marxist theory, that as people get richer, they need religion less, bless you, and so ultimately religion is doomed as communism and socialism come in. So, because capitalism and its oppressive system is ultimately doomed to destruction, right? For Marx, capitalism contains the seeds of its own demise. Ultimately, religion is going to go with it because it also contains the seeds of its own demise, right? So religion should have no place in materialistic, advanced socialist societies. And what we get then is, I guess somewhat preemptively, is societies like the Soviet Union are like, yay, we've achieved socialism, so no, religion is now banned, right? Or we're going to punish people who are religious because it has no place in a materialistic, advanced socialist society. Now, how materialistic or materialistically advanced and socialist the Soviet Union or even communist China actually were is something quite debatable. But they were like, well, we've achieved socialism, so no more religion is necessary, right? So this has had actual real world kind of effects. All right. Now, I've got a thumbs down and a please for God's sake stop from Daisha. So I guess I'll stop. Let's stop. I was going to stop anyway, but there you go. All right, we'll see you all on Thursday. Oh, Daisha, can you come talk to me after class? Because you had a question for me and I have the answer for you. Yes. Do you know another Daisha? No. Yeah, just come on down.